Hello and welcome dear students. In today's lecture, we will be discussing Hobbes individualism. Let me first highlight the objectives of this lecture. Number one is to understand the concept of individualism. Number second is to explain Hobbes' contribution to the theory of individualism. Number third is to assess why Hobbes preferred the sovereign state, and finally to critically analyze how Hobbes strikes a balance between the sovereign state and individual liberty. One of the Thomas Hobbes' greatest contributions was the philosophy of individualism, which not only made him a highly influential modern thinker, but also pertinent in today's complex world. He emphasized that the individual's life in the state of nature would be in a state of insecurity and continuous fear. He viewed war-like situation and conflict of interest as enduring and normal state of affairs under which human beings are conditioned to live without the control of any political authority. While achieving law and order, he advocated for an absolute monarch who possessed power and authority. More importantly, many political theorists believe that Hobbes' theory of individualism distinguished sharply with his contemporary John Locke. In order to see how Hobbes is more individualistic in his thought, an analysis of his conceptions of theory of human nature, conceptions of society and liberty is very important. It will help us to critically assess his liberal ideas and beliefs pertaining to human society. Accordingly, in this lecture, an attempt has been made to make you understand Hobbes' individualism, though he suggests some reasons for favoring the sovereign state over individual liberty and life preservation, as originate in his classic treatise Leviathan. Confirmation in support of his theory of individualism includes the idea that political authority is based upon the approval of the governor. His conception is of fairness and self-preservation. These aforementioned ideas comprise the basis for Hobbes to strike a balance between the sovereign state and individual liberty. Thus, it is important to look at the evolution of the idea of individualism first. Individualism generally refers to treat the interests of the individual as a priori and hold this primacy over the collective or group interests. It is the quality of being different from other people and doing things in your own way. Negatively, it opposes all kinds of authority, especially when it is exercised by the state that restricts individual liberty and autonomy. As a theory of human nature, it believes that in order to choose one's own goals and means to achieve them, individual must be given much freedom and responsibility. Thus, individualism places greater importance on the value of self-reliance and the supreme importance of the individual, and all individuals are morally equal. Etymologically speaking, the origin of liberal individualism can be traced from the beginning of the modern age. There was little concept of individualism or distinct identities among people during the feudal era. Individuals' identity was identified with community life. The nature of these groups greatly influenced people's lives and identities, a process that was largely constant across generations. With the beginning of modern age, a new intellectual climate emerged which caused the death of feudal tendencies and group-based individual life. With Renaissance and Reformation, religious explanation of individual societies got replaced with rational and scientific explanations. Individual and his freedom became the prime concern. Individual-based studies were conducted. These studies have found that people have unique personal attributes that made them distinctive and valuable. The development of theories based on natural rights during the 17th and 18th centuries was indicative of this fact. Hobbes and other contractual philosophers held a similar view regarding the inherent worth and dignity of all people. Thus, people in the modern era were seen as ends in themselves. The society, state, and other social institutions became means to serve the individual ends. Hence, individualism, which means a belief in the primacy of the individual, interest, and freedom, gradually became the characteristic theme of liberal political theory that influenced the liberal political thinkers like Hobbes, John Locke, Bentham, J.S. Mill in different ways. It prompted some liberals to describe society as a group of independent people, each pursuing their own goals and needs. This kind of thinking has been linked to atomism, the theory that social groups are not what make up society, but rather a collection of self-interested and mostly independent individuals or atoms. Put another way, this kind of extreme individualism is predicated on the idea that people are essentially self-seeking, egoistic, and self-reliant. This led C.B. Macpherson to characterize early liberalism, especially of Hobbes and Locke, as possessive individualism. It regarded the individual as the proprietor of his own person or capacities, owing nothing to society for them. Modern liberals, on the other hand, have always had a more positive perception of human nature. They contend that a sense of social duty, particularly toward those who are unable to care for themselves, serves to temper egoism. Hence, to quote Andrew Hayward, whether egoism is unrestrained or is qualified by a sense of social responsibility, liberals are united in their desire to create a society in which each person is capable of developing and flourishing to the fullness of his or her potential. Dear students, let us now talk about Hobbes and his theory of individualism. Among all individualist thinkers, Hobbes is generally considered as one of the great individualist political thinker. He was the first political thinker in modern political theory who, on the basis of resolutive composite method which he borrowed from Galileo, logically established that man is utilitarian by nature and so man is individualistic by nature. He also believed that man is individualistic by nature and social only out of necessity. While making this claim about the state of human nature, C.V. Macpherson called Hobbes a scholar of possessive individualism. Nonetheless, possessive individualism is a capitalist based philosophy that holds that whatever man possesses are because of his own labor or hard work. Hence, he cannot be compelled to share his property with society. In light of the above discussion, therefore, Hobbes' individualism implies that man is prior to the state and his self-interest is more supreme. His theory of individualism is based on the idea that an individual is more important than any social group or collective entity. On methodological point of view, Hobbes' theory of individualism suggests that the individual is central to any political or social explanation. He also believes that all explanations about society should be individual centered who compose it. The well-being of individual is the well-being of whole society. However, from the ethical point of view, Hobbesian individualism implies that society ought to be established to serve the individual good. It gives moral priority to individual rights, his needs and interests over the society or community welfare. Hobbes, being very close to classical liberalism, subscribes egoistical individualism in his book Leviathan, which gives much importance to serve self-interest and self-reliance. In contrast to classical liberals, liberal thinkers of today such as J.S. Mill and T.H. Green have developed a developmental theory of individualism that puts the well-being of people above the pursuit of self-interest. Nonetheless, significant events in the lives of notable intellectuals frequently aid in analyzing their perspective and philosophical tenets. This claim was supported by Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was deeply rooted in studying historical situations of the then English society. He was clear in his thought and brings new ideas for theorization that made him outstanding and distinctive thinker of his time. While witnessing the civil war in England in 1641, his writings, especially his book Leviathan, tried to address the problem of peace, security and order. These issues became significant for further theorization in political theory. The cover page of his magnum opus, Leviathan, encapsulated the essence of his theory of individualism by listing all the crucial elements of a contemporary society, including striking a balance between the atomistic individuality and absolute monarchy. For Hobbes, convenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. The bonds of words are too weak to bridle man's ambition, avarice, anger and other passions without the fear of some coercive power. Hobbes developed a political theory different from Aristotle. Unlike the later, Hobbes claimed that human beings were not social. The state is an artificial creation, a product of convention and rational human action. Hence, this man-made political authority will be obeyed on the condition of self-preservation. Hobbes' deep concern for maintaining social order stemmed in large part from two events in his life that left him fearing a violent death and feeling that life must be fully enjoyed. These two incidents in his life have a direct bearing on Hobbes to support absolute power of the sovereign over individual liberty. First event was fear of the Spanish Armada, which stipulated his mother's labor and Hobbes' premature birth. Second was the outbreak of civil war in England in 1641 that forced Hobbes to leave England. In these circumstances, he made an observation that fear and I was born to Venice. Hence, these reasons led him to put forward a case for despotism. Since it was the most atrocious historical event in England in which Hobbes was born, given the circumstances, it was inevitable for Hobbes to call for the establishment a kind of authoritarian government for maintaining peace and security. In fact, this also became a reason for Hobbes to write about the dark picture of human nature in his book Leviathan. Hobbes contends that people are just going through the motions of existence because of self-centered interests and desires for indulgence and self-preservation. People will search for capital to support their lives as well as enjoyable activities and steer clear of hazardous situations. Put simply, human behavior is driven by and ultimately shaped by its desires. In order to fulfill their interests or for their survival, they will fight with each other, especially when economic resources are scarce. Hobbes calls this situation as state of nature, which is condition not worth living for humans because individual was nasty, brutish and selfish. To overcome this problem, Hobbes propounded his theory of law of nature, but it is not the kind of natural law that most people would assume. According to Tocqueville, many political theorists like Locke have assumed that the laws of nature are a system of moral precepts that everyone can understand through reason. However, Hobbes' law of nature is derived from logical reasoning and not moral principle. That logical reasoning for humans was to seek an end of their sufferings caused by and in the state of nature. Self-preservation was considered by Hobbes to be the most important right. This idea he borrowed from Grotius, who argued in the law of war and peace that everyone had the right to self-preservation and that under all circumstances no one could ever be held accountable for acting in a way that allowed them to survive. Thus, the right to self-preservation was regarded by Grotius and Hobbes as a sufficient foundation for morality. In these circumstances, a person would not act aggressively towards others unless provoked or felt threatened. In short, Grotius and Hobbes agreed that there is a room for understanding between people. For Hobbes, fear and self-interest are two powerful human motivations that the sovereign king had to manage and control. It will rescue human beings from the state of nature and will put them into a situation which would be reasonably peaceful and good. Hobbes convened a social contract to strike a balance between the nature of individual liberty and absolute legal sovereignty of the monarch. He realized that a zero-sum game produced sovereign power which guaranteed total harmony. Conversely, its lack indicated anarchy or instability. According to Hobbes, quote, "The resulting conflicts give individuals strong reasons to band together to set up some institution capable of settling these conflicts peacefully. That institution is of course the state, which Hobbes thought of as essentially a mechanism of authoritative dispute resolution using coercive power to enforce peaceful cooperation among citizens." Unquote. My dear students, let us now talk about Hobbesian philosophy, a synthesis of individualism and absolutism. In Hobbes' theory, individualism and state absolutism are complementary to each other. His advocacy for the idea of absolute sovereignty was to strike a balance with state of anarchy prevalent in the state of nature. In fact, his synthesis of liberal and illiberal elements could be seen in his great work Leviathan. Although he reached absolutist and illiberal conclusions in his work, his premises were liberal and individualistic. He favored individual liberty because people were free to make both the state and society, to serve their interests, to seek legitimacy in exercising political authority. Consent of the individual was very important. Some critics believe that Hobbesian philosophy was illiberal because he supported the theory of powerful sovereign as self-perpetuating one. There was no procedure in social contract how to intermittently refurbish the individual's consent to the sovereign power. The society was made up of disparate, disjointed people who were not cohesive. However, Hobbes accepted that people are self-centered, egoistic and atomistic. This negative picture of human nature became a cornerstone for Hobbes to acknowledge the role of all-powerful state. The individual did not become a part of the all-powerful state because they retained their freedom, particularly with regard to their thoughts and economic endeavors. It did not vanish into a faceless crowd or a unified society. He kept their uniqueness and character. Once sovereign power becomes a threat to individual life, he loses his legitimacy of exercising power over the individuals. As long as people believed that society was vital to further their own interests, it was cooperative endeavor. According to Sabine, quote, "Hobbes was the greatest and most consistent individualist. He portrayed rugged individualism in politics, economics, and religion. Unquote. In Hobbes' classic work Leviathan, two themes were intertwining with one another. One was the concern for social order and the other was individual freedom. That was the reason for Hobbes to strike a balance between absolutism and individualism. With absolutism, the war of all against all will get replaced into a well ordered society, but the competition for power and economic goods will continue, though the conflict will not be deadly but peaceful and intense. C.B. Macpherson says, Hobbesian individuals are post-medieval men of early capitalist society. They are independent but essentially individualistic. They fused the separate elements of the political order to eliminate the state of war. Like Machiavelli, Hobbes acknowledges that political and social arrangements were impacted by the pursuit of self-interest. Politics, according to Hobbes, is the study of competing but valid claims made by individuals in a secure situation. It took the atomistic individuals, their instincts and reasons as a source of morality and sociability in order to demonstrate his defense of individual freedom. Presumed relationships and traditionally assigned status had no place in such circumstances. Hobbes' definition of freedom as the individual's private pursuit suggested that everyone could define freedom in their own unique ways within the constraints of the state. Liberty was defined as what the law allowed and what the law said nothing about. Freedom is the absence of constraints and force. Hobbes recognized that everyone had the right to hold private beliefs because conscience was a free thought and the Leviathan could not force people to hold beliefs against their will. Still, the Leviathan could order the person to carry out rituals that were required for public worship. Hobbes started the process of defining and defending what was essentially a person's private domain over which no one could have authority, not even the government. Locke's ideas about a limited state and his assertion of inalienable individual rights gave rise to a stronger public-private divide in his philosophy. Hobbes' defense of private property revealed the boundaries of the state. There would be no excessive meddling in a person's private matters, including their economic activity, even though the sovereign had absolute authority over private property. If they did not have the freedom to buy and sell, they would enter into agreements with one another. Beyond providing public charity to the impoverished, the state had no obligation to actively advance the felicity of its subjects. The only restriction on the enormous range of absolute powers that Hobbes bestowed upon the sovereign was the right to self-preservation, which he considered to be an inalienable personal right. Since life is a gift from nature to humans, no one has the authority to order the killing of an individual. Therefore, the sovereign could not order a man to kill himself. Individuals' inalienable rights persisted because self-preservation was the primary driver behind their complete shedding of authority. Only in cases where the right to self-preservation was in danger could the right to resistance be used. Hobbes categorically rejected the modern interpretation put forth by some political theorists such as Gautier and Hampton, that Hobbes was interested in calculating utilities because he believed that safety concerns, not narrow gains, were what drove human behavior. Dear students, the important question was, should individuals obey the absolute sovereign? To answer this question, Hobbes provided several arguments for why the sovereign power should be obeyed. First, it is the precondition for the enjoyment of individual liberty. Second, there was a purely prudential consideration that if individuals disobeyed the sovereign, they would be punished. Third, there was a moral consideration that they had a moral obligation to uphold their agreements, and Leviathan need to ensure that all parties had to adhere to the terms of the agreement. Fourth, there was a political reason that the sovereign was their legally recognized representative chosen voluntarily by the people to represent them. Fifth and last, Hobbes offered a religious condition when he asserted that civil law and the law of nature were one and that both were to be obeyed since they implied God's commands. These were the grounds upon which government could be justified or even exist. Critics countered that rather than defending individual liberty, absolute sovereign power would jeopardize it. They also noted that although he emphasized the significance of the absolute sovereign, he fails to recognize that his absolute sovereign will be unstable in the absence of a theory of political obligation. There are further issues if Hobbes' understanding of the laws of nature as divine commands is the only way we can give him a theory of political obligation. In fact, to postulate a belief in God would be to introduce an extraneous factor which is not allowed by his theory of law of nature. Critics further said that for something to be a law, it must be known or written down clearly. In the case of the laws of nature, it is not clear in Leviathan how the laws of nature are to be interpreted. Therefore, both these interpretations, the laws of nature as God's commands and the laws as rational precepts, creates problem for Hobbes' theory of individual liberty. Even if the political route to individual liberty that Hobbes outlines is problematic, at least one could say that the ideal of individual liberty upheld by him is attractive. His argument that liberty is consistent with fear is unacceptable to many critics, even though Hobbes tried to justify this argument with his theory of consent that provides the basis of all political leadership. But critics have pointed out the consent that Hobbes talks about is a hypothetical consent. It is a consent that is given in a situation when one has a fear of losing one's life. It thus becomes obvious to conclude that the ideas of liberty or consent lose much of their political appeal. Dear students, to conclude today's lecture, we can say that Hobbes is regarded as the great individualist of all times because using the resolutive composite method of Galileo, he was the first to logically establish that a person is individualistic by nature and consequently utilitarian by nature. Individualism as a theory means that man is prior to the state, which means self-interest is supreme. For Hobbes, humans are essentially individualistic and only become social when necessary. Hobbes' philosophy is centered on the individual and his personal security. The state is only a means to an end, which is the preservation of the life of the individual. In Hobbes' philosophy, everything is for the individual, of the individual, and by the individual, and there is nothing beyond the individual. That way, probably Hobbes is the greatest individualist of all time. The right to resistance of his individualism is the surest indication of his theory of individualism. Thank you, dear students, for patiently listening to my lecture. I hope you would have enjoyed.